Okay, 7th graders, here's your test corrections for last Friday's test, which we called FA2. It had 3 components: mental math, the regular problems, and the 4 problems that were on the board. So I want you to go through all of them and make sure you make test corrections to anything that you missed. Now, there was one of the 4 problems that I gave you credit for, and it was actually wrong. So I want everyone to check your 4 problems, especially problem number 2. Okay? So let's move on to mental math. I'm going to read the problem and write it down as I say it. And it is A would be -5 minus 7. And so your answer would be a -12. B was -3 minus a -15, which gives you a +12. C, -20 times -3, which gives you a +60. D, -22 plus 7, which gives you a -15. E, 35 minus 5 plus 9, which would give you a 39. F, you had to name the property. And what I said was 3 times the quantity x minus 2 is equal to 3x minus 6. And that's the distribution property. You should have written down distribution. G, you had to name the property. And I said 2 plus 3 plus 5 is equal to 2 plus 5 plus 3. Because I didn't use any words that meant quantity or associate, for we know that this is the commutative property of addition. H, I said 2 multiplied by the quantity of 3 times 5 is equal to the quantity of 2 times 3 multiplied by 5. Because I use that phrase quantity, I know I'm using parentheses, which means I'm using the associative property, and this is all multiplication. I said 2 times 4 times 6 is equal to 6 times 4 times 2. So no parentheses, we're using the commutative property of multiplication. And J, the quantity of 2 plus 1 added to 4 is equal to 2 added to the quantity of 1 plus 4. And again, that word quantity is telling me parentheses, which tells me associative property of addition. All right, let's look at our real test. And our real test, the first 2 problems, we just have to remember our rules. A negative times a negative is equal to a positive. A positive times a positive is equal to a positive, and a negative times a positive is equal to a negative. And the same is true if you do division. Negative divided by negative equals positive. Positive divided by positive equals positive. Negative divided by positive equals negative. So when I look at number 1, I know that it's a positive answer. And then I should have done 13 times 5 off on the side, and I would have gotten 65. Box your answers. Number 2. A negative divided by a positive gives me a negative. And when you do your long division, if that's how you want to do it, or you can take it to its primes. Remember, 42 is 6 times 7, and 14 is 2 times 7. And 6 is really 2 times 3. And I can cross out my equivalent forms of 1, and I'm left with a 3. So my answer is -3, because a negative divided by a positive is a negative. Number 3, in order to solve this problem, you have to use GEMDAS. And GEMDAS says what's inside those grouping symbols. The absolute value of -18 is 18, minus the absolute value of 26 is 26. Now I don't subtract in algebra, I add the opposite. So I have more negatives than positive, my answer is going to be negative. That means they're different. One's positive, one's negative, so I'm going to subtract. And 16 minus 8 is 8, and 1 minus 1 is 0. So my answer ends up being a negative 8. Now, in order to describe the term absolute value, you had to use two methods. For definition, I was looking for the word distance. The absolute value is the distance a number is away from 0. For an example, I was looking for you to show the absolute value of a negative number and the absolute value of the positive number are equaling the same thing. For the diagram, I was looking for a number line. And if I wanted to show the absolute value of negative 6, I would show a negative 6 on the number line. And then I would show that it was so many units or hops away from 0. Okay. Number 5, adding and subtracting. This is a very basic skill, but you have to remember to check your signs. Number 5 has negatives plus negatives. That means I have these 16 of these guys, and I'm adding 34 of these guys, which means my answer must be negative. When I put these all together, I have all negatives. So add them. 34 plus 16, and we get 50. Okay? And number 6, I never subtract in algebra. I add the opposite, which means I have 14 positives, but I have 25 negatives. There's more negatives, which means my answer is going to be a negative. And since they're different signs, I'm going to subtract. So my answer becomes negative 11. Okay, let's look at the using GEMDAS. I have to solve this problem. So I want to show that I have to do my grouping symbols first. So I leave my 6 squared, I leave my subtraction sign. 3 plus 2 is 5, and that's a times 5. Done with my grouping symbols. Now I have to do exponents. 6 squared is my exponent. 6 squared means 6 times 6, which is a 36. So I have 36 minus 5 times 5. You can't drop any of your operations. The subtraction and the multiplication sign have to stay in all the way along until you use them. Now I'm going to do multiplication left to right, which means that I have to do this piece before I do this piece. So I'm going to write 36 minus, and I'm solving 5 times 5, which is 25. And 36 minus 25 is really 36 plus a negative 25. They're different. I have more positives, so my answer is going to be positive, and I can just subtract and get 11. Okay, and now I'm going to do the CS question, and I'm going to show you the steps. I'm going to rewrite it. Lots of you guys tried to do this in your head without solving it algebraically and using your steps. I have to do what's inside this parenthesis before I can take the absolute value sign off. So I have the absolute value of 4, because 9 minus 5 is 4, minus, and now I have another absolute value sign, and I can solve it. The absolute value of negative 2 is 2. So I have to come back, and I have another absolute value sign. The absolute value of 4 is 4 minus that 2, which is equal to 2. And so that gives me the answer of C. All right, then we had problems. And the 4 problems, number 2, I actually messed up on. And so some of you got points when you shouldn't have, and some of you I owe a point to. So make sure you check number 2. Number 1 said x minus 3 plus the absolute value of y times z. And x was a negative 2. Y was a negative 4, and z was the negative half. So I'm going to plug in my values, negative 2 for x, minus 3, plus the negative 4 for that y, times the z, which is negative half. Okay? That's a multiplication sign. Now I'm going to do what's in my grouping symbols first. The first grouping symbol is this one. It's there just to show it's a negative 2. So I can rewrite it, negative 2 plus a negative 3 plus. Now I have another grouping symbol. I have the absolute value of negative 4, which is 4, times and I have another parenthesis, which is negative 1/2, and I can just show that I'm multiplying it by that 4. All right, so the next step says we're done with parentheses. We do exponents. We have no exponents, so we're going to do multiplication and division left to right. This is our multiplication piece. This is 4 over 1 times a negative 1 over 2. So I can find my equivalent forms of 1 and say that I have a 1 left here and a 2 left here. Because 4 is really 2 times 2, so I can cancel out my 2's. So I have a 2 times a negative 1, which leaves me with a negative 2. So write the rest of your problem, and then plug in that negative 2 for the piece you just solved. Now we do adding and subtracting left to right. Negative 2 plus negative 3 is negative 5, plus that negative 2. And negative 5 plus negative 2 is negative 7. So this is problem number 1. Let's look at. Now this is the one that some of you may have gotten wrong and you didn't know it. If you wrote the answer as negative 1, it's really wrong. If you wrote the answer as a negative 4, you should have gotten points. So if I owe you points, you need to come see me tomorrow. So number 2 said 3x plus xy over z. And again, x was negative 2, y was negative 4, and z was negative 1/2. So we're going to plug in our values. 3 times x is that negative 2. Negative 2 times negative 4, all over a negative 1/2. Now we've got the values plugged in. Let's solve. We're going to do our multiplication first. 3 times negative 2 is negative 6, plus a negative 2 times a negative 4 is a positive 8, divided by a negative 1/2. A negative 6 plus 8 is 2, divided by a negative 1/2. Some of you left it like this. Never, ever, ever leave a problem looking something weird like this. Read it. What does it say? It says 2 divided by a negative 1/2. We don't divide by fractions. We multiply by the reciprocal. So show multiplying by the reciprocal. And a 2 times a negative 2 is a negative 4. And that should have been the correct answer. So if you got negative 4 and I didn't give you credit for it, come see me tomorrow and I'll give you a point. All right, let's look at the third problem. The third problem was negative absolute value of x minus absolute value of y minus absolute value of z. And remember, x is a negative 2, y is a negative 4, and z is a negative 1/2. So let's plug it in. We have the negative absolute value of negative 2 minus the absolute value of negative 4 minus the absolute value of negative 1/2. And to solve this, I have to do my grouping symbols, these absolute values, first. So I leave my negative signs. The absolute value of negative 2 is 2. Leave my subtraction sign. The absolute value of negative 4 is 4. Leave my subtraction sign. The absolute value of negative 1/2 is 1/2. Change all of your subtraction to addition and change the sign next to it. Negative 2 plus negative 4 is negative 6 plus a negative 1/2. And I have a negative 6 plus a negative 1/2 gives me a negative 6.5. And this is my final answer for number 3. All right, let's look at the last. And the last problem says 4 times the quantity x minus 2 minus yz plus 4. And remember, x is negative 2, y is negative 4, and z is negative 1/2. So I'm going to plug my values in. X is negative 2 minus 2. My y is a negative 4. My z is a negative 1/2. And remember, those guys are multiplied together, plus a 4. Now let's solve. We have to do grouping symbols first. So I have to solve what's in here first. So that's really a negative 2 plus a negative 2, which gives me a 4 times a negative 4. Minus, and now I have to do these guys. The parentheses are there just to show they're being multiplied together. So I can do them. Negative 4 times Negative 1/2 is negative 4 over 1 times negative 1 over 2. We'll take everything to its primes. Negative 4 is really a negative 1 times a 2 times a 2. I can cancel out my 2's. And I'm left with a negative 1 times a 2, which is negative 2, times a negative 1, which is a positive 2, plus 4. Okay, and since now I still have some more multiplication to do. 4 times negative 4 is negative 16, plus a negative 2, plus a 4. Negative 16 plus negative 2 is negative 18, plus 4 is really a negative 14. And I'm going to box my answer. All right, remember, if I owe you a point, come see me tomorrow.